Hello, Music 595 students. I miss being with you. I'm excited to get through this weird shelter-in-place mini era in which we're living. Today, I decided to do a couple of things in having this discussion about transmedia and verbal scores with you. One is I set this up so that it would look like our regular seminar table as much as I could in our dining room. And at the same time, having a little distance here to remind you to keep your distance from people for the time being. Also, I wanted to have this natural light coming in from the side, sort of a Vermeer look, because we're talking a little bit about music and its relationship to the visual arts, particularly in scoring after the middle of the 20th century. You'll recall that we talked previously about indeterminacy in scoring of this late era of concert music. And just to show you a couple scores here, this is from a Morton Feldman piece. You can see the proportional notation there. You have some bar lines, but there's just space showing you this sort of relative to that other attack. It's all displayed in space terms, but not with actual note values. Here's a few other ones. This is, I think, a Lucas Foss score, and you can see the varieties of indeterminacy reflected in the notation there. Oh, this Roger Reynolds Blind Men piece is got a lot of great stuff in it. In indeterminacy. I want to go though to these pieces. They're called October 1952, November 1952, and December 1952 by Earl Brown. He's another one of these New York School composers like Feldman and John Cage. And it's really in that group who were so strongly networked with visual artists in New York that we see the rise of not only indeterminacy, but this move into having scores be also visual art. Now, Earl Brown in October 1952, or October 52, you can see that the score here, it gives you most of the information you're used to as far as durations, pitches, and whatnot, although there are no clefs. It is a piano piece. It's written for the pianist David Tudor, so we would presume it's grand staff material. You go to November 52, and it looks like that, and you have this gigantic staff, all of these lines, no clefs, really nothing except the decisions made by the performer along the way. I should mention to you that Tudor would take these scores and make his own scores from them, because you have to rehearse it, you have to practice it, and so you're doing it the same way every time. So he would get the score from, in this case, Earl Brown, and then make his own score with the specific pitches, what clefs he's using and so on, the specific durations, so that he could practice it and it would be the same every time, even though the score makes it look like this is going to be pretty loose and different every time. Well, for each performer it might be different, or even ensemble it might be different, but Tudor felt like, I want to learn it my way. I'll translate, in effect, that score into notation that allows me to practice it and be the same each time. Now, the big piece in this series is December 1952. Earl Brown's piece that is believe it or not, this score, the most anthologized complete score of the 20th century. I think that's true. You'll see that image in so many places. Now, when I was editing the journal American Music, I was fortunate to be able to publish a transcript of a cassette that Earl Brown made in which he talks about the construction of that score. It's very interesting. It looks like it's sort of intuitive shapes and whatnot, but he actually had a very systematic way of creating that score. Now, I think it's a fascinating score, and it's been interpreted in so many ways, and it's been played by David Tudor on piano, but also by small chamber groups and even orchestral groups realizing that score. I wanted to point out to you now, though, that that score is really, to me, the hinge into transmedia scores as they were conducted, created in the latter half of the 20th century. I've given you a packet here on transmedia and verbal scores. And let me just point out to you what this first page says here. You've got transmedia scores that are music and visual art at the same time. That's what we see in December 1952. The score may be used as the basis for improvisational realization or be appreciated as graphic art or design. And I give references to some other works, Cornelis Cardew's work, Treatise, for example, works by Bussati and Halbenstock-Ramati. I'll show you some of those examples in a moment. Or also music and theater at the same time. So the score gives directions not only for making musical sounds, not audio or oral sounds, but also for movement, gesture, speech, characterizations, and so forth. I give some examples from history here. This is from 1613. This score, this is by Antonio Esquerro Esteban. And you can see, when you see that score, obviously, this is a Christian work. It's trying to represent the cross of Jesus in the layout of the score itself. So in that sense, it's a visual, it's symbolic, not just of pitches to play, shapes, gestures, and so forth that we're accustomed to in conventional notation, but it's about reflecting the spiritual basis of the work in that score. So this is very old, from the 17th century. And here is another one from that the same collection that one was from. You can see the chessboard reflected here, and I don't know the instructions for how to realize that, but you can look at some even works that, oh man, I don't even know whose work this is, but if you look at some of these scores, in this case a keyboard score from this would be 17th century as well, and you can see at the bottom here those shapes, the up and down. There was a lot of clearly interest in, fascination with having these things, not just scales to be played on the piano, but to be reflected in that notation. And so you then go into the 18th century Haydn. So this is from the manuscript of the first of his Geistliche Kanonen. So canons here. Well, spiritual canons is what that means. And when you see that, well, obviously there's a Trinitarian and sort of reflection of infinity in a way, or the eternal nature of circles, that is, no beginning, no end, in this score. Trinitarian, of course, because you have the three that are one in a sense. you have to memorize it. I don't think you'd be playing it or singing it in this case while you're turning it, maybe, but the important thing for him is to show in the notation the kind of spiritual foundations behind what he's writing here. Well, you see in the packet, I also have another representation of December 1952. And then you have the sextet, The Tiger's Mind. We'll come back to that in just a moment. This Robert Moran, Titus 1 for amplified automobile. This is something that would be projected, actually, this image projected onto an automobile that was fitted with microphones, and the players would follow the shapes on that, again, and make sounds with various implements on the automobile based on this really visual art piece. If you look at a lot of the George Crumb pieces from the Macrocosmos works of his, well, this one's Spiral Galaxy. It's pretty obvious. The symbolism there, it's in the score itself. He loved doing that kind of thing. Look at this Crucifixus of his. It's very much like that one we saw from the 17th century. Just laid out as a cross. There's some others here in the packet. Twin Suns. This one is very much a part of its era. This is from 1973, and this is the Agnus Dei of this Macrocosmos set. Again, taking the name Agnus Dei from the Mass Ordinary, but you can see that's a peace symbol, which is a very important symbol of the late 1960s and into the 1970s, and beyond, of course. But you see he's laid this out. He wants to have that be projected, in a sense, in the score itself. Let me show you a couple other of these that are moving into the visual art realm. This is one by William Kraft. This is the score to a piece called Colorations. It looks a little bit like some of those Augusta Reed Thomas sketches that we saw. They're multicolored. And this, in fact, is from a website where they're selling this score, the printed score, for 150 bucks in this case. This is from 1972. It's got these shapes and so forth to be realized in some way, but it's not a sketch. This is the actual score from which you would play. Here's a piece by Haubenstocker Amati. I mentioned him earlier. This is multiple 1. You've got a lot of instructions here how to realize the score, but the score itself is that. Again, we've moved here from mere indeterminacy, if I can call it that, to this sort of almost flamboyant, yet at the same time introspective visual artistry that has its own appeal. These pieces by Silvano Busotti from 1959, you could see him a very interesting sort of bleeding from conventional, let's see, this is a good example, conventional keyboard notation into something more elaborate and beguiling in many ways that you could hang on a wall. I worked with the composer Andrew Newell at University of Illinois, and he would get up early in the morning and make these wonderful scores of this sort. Here's another Busotti. they could be played and were played beautifully, but he could also sell prints of them as wall hangings. So he was very conscious of this dual nature of the scores he was producing. I'll show you one more of these in this transmedia realm of scoring for musical execution and visual appeal. This is actually a finale file that didn't print out right. And so a student gave this to me, said, oh, this is all messed up. Well, it's really impossible to read and play the notes on the instruments shown, but it has this interesting crossover appeal to suddenly being in the realm of abstract art. So, let's talk about verbal scores. And I guess before we get into that, I want to mention this one that was in the packet. This is Cornelius Cardew's piece, Sextet, The Tiger's Mind. This is not a verbal score, even though all that we have are words here. I'll explain to you the difference in a minute, but I'll just read you the day piece, the first of the two sections of this piece. The tiger fights the mind that loves the circle that traps the tiger. The circle is perfect and outside time. The wind blows dust in tiger's eyes. Amy reflects, relaxes with her mind, which puts out buds, emulates the tree. Amy jumps through the circle and comforts the tiger. The tiger sleeps in the tree. High wind. Amy climbs the tree, which groans in the wind and succumbs. The tiger burns. Well, this is not a verbal score in the way that we're going to talk about them and the way we think of verbal scores, because this is not giving you instructions on what to play or how to play it. This is really a set of, well, it's sort of poetry in a way, sort of a prose poem. It also has a theatrical aspect to it. And if you go on YouTube, you'll find multiple performances videoed of this piece, The Tiger's Mind. They've had to realize it in different ways. But it's not a verbal score, even though it's just words. It's in a transmedia realm, in this case, sort of bridging from a musical score as we're accustomed to into something that's quite literary, maybe dramatic, theatrical in a way. And this is actually performed in very theatrical ways. Let's talk about verbal scores then, as we normally encounter them. Verbal scores are when the composer tells people what to do to produce the sounds that he or she wants to have heard. I've given you these examples from, there's two examples here. Steve Reich's Pendulum Music, great piece. I've mounted a performance of that. Oh, also Christian Wolff's piece Play, and Charlemagne Palestine's Overtone Study. And you'll see in these, you're given directions. Here's what to do. It's not notation. It's not even telling you, here's the sounds you're going to get. It's just saying, do these things, and that will give you not only the sounds I want to get, but the kind of interaction of a chamber group that I want to have happen. There's a social aspect to these very often, how players are going to interact with each other, listening to each other for cues on what to do next or how to modify the thing that you're doing. Christian Wolff has a lot of examples of this. This is from his prose collection. And this piece, like a lot of the verbal scores of the early 1970s, was written for non-musicians, that is to say, untrained musicians. Now, they could be trained, but that's not the point. You want to have people of varying abilities or no musical prowess whatsoever take part in these pieces. And so, in this case, they're written for school children who have mixed, again, musical training or ability, but they can play together a piece that will produce sounds, but also give them that chamber music interaction that, as we know, is so valuable from a social point of view. There's a page in your packet here from Christian Asplin's and my book on Christian Wolff that talks about the piece Edges and these prose compositions as well. So I would read that to give you some context for them and their writing. This is the last one that you have in the packet. This is by Karl-Heinz Stockhausen, who's usually known for hyper-deterministic scoring. You've seen some of his keyboard music in an earlier unit in here. Very precise. Dynamics could be extraordinarily inflated. So, 6 Ps, 6 Fs on the high end of the piano, for example. It's like, how would you do that given the constraints of these short pieces of string on the piano? It's hard to say. But these prose compositions, these verbal scores of his, came from around 1970. I think both sets of them. Let's see, Aus der Siebentagen is one of them, and Für kommende Zeit is another one. Well, I was in a record store in Southern California in the late 1970s, and I always would go through the bins looking for interesting experimental avant-garde composers. Often they were on budget labels, so I could get them cheap. And I found this Stockhausen recording, and it had 2 pieces on it, one for each side of the record, Ceylon and Bird of Passage. And I played it, record player. I thought, well, this is sort of a weird, interesting piece. I was interested in it. It wasn't my favorite piece, but I was interested in anything of this sort. And it was only years later that I ran across the score. This is the entire score to the 20-plus minute piece on this record, Bird of Passage. The score is play, sing, those are words sitting on top of each other, as parallel as possible with the others. Make exceptions and long pauses. Bring the whole to a standstill, fly away. That's the score. And from that, the players got together and created this piece, recorded it. I bought it, from a bin in Southern California. So this very simple verbal score resulted in a lot of music that I'm sure every time they played it was quite different. It's on the verge of just pure free improvisation, but with some general cues given you here, not specific as the cues in, say, Christian Wolff scores would be. This is all you need to sort of get you going, and each player would have to decide, well, where are we in this? What do I do now? When and certainly, when do I fly away? As the last line says to do. There's a couple others that aren't in your packet. I just thought I'd show you. This is a really important piece. And this one you should just look up online and hear recordings of it. This is Alvin Lucier's I Am Sitting in a Room. Read the instructions. that constitute this verbal score on what to do and how to do it and how it's realized is an extremely influential piece. This piece, lesser known by Barney Childs, who's an American composer, did a lot of these transmedia, verbal scores, lots of indeterminacy, and so forth. This piece called London Rice Wine. It's for any woodwind instrument. That's the indeterminacy with respect to instrumentation. And I'll just read a part of it. It says, play few or many good sounds. Play a pitch. This is the real sound, and by making it, you rule all. Enjoy this. Play, all caps there. Make it be heard, and so forth. It's kind of like a spiritual discipline in a way. And a number of these verbal scores that I've seen are that way. It's really, it's about what Pauline Oliveros called deep listening. You're getting into a profound sense of perception and attention to the sounds you're making and the sounds you're hearing. And there's really no point in making a score for that, because it's all about the directions that you need to follow to get into that zone of perception and attention. So there's our introduction into transmedia and verbal scores. I think that's useful. It's the best I can do here on this snowy morning, improvising for you during the hour that we would normally be meeting in class, but are disallowed from doing. I hope you have a great day and you are enjoying the quarantine, which should be a time of meditation and gaining perception and attention as well. I like to think of the line of Larry Brilliant when he's talking about this period of sequestration. He says, I like to think I'm in a meditation retreat. I don't know if you're having that experience, but I hope you are, to some extent at least. And I know that this that we've gone through today will be useful for you in your appreciation of lots of scores of the late 20th century and early 21st. Farewell for now.